Hello, so today's video is going to be what is Asperger syndrome? In a nutshell, Asperger syndrome is a high-functioning autistic disorder, and some of the symptoms include an intense interest in a narrow subject or limited topic, unusual use of language, missing social cues, unusual speech, such as a monotone or yelling. When I say unusual use of language, I mean, for example, speaking overly formally is common. There are no language deficiencies in Asperger syndrome. Other symptoms include sensory issues, poor motor control, such as sloppy handwriting, and sorry, something popped up. Oh yeah, sorry. And the last big one would be rigidity, being inflexible, liking routine, not liking change. And I'm not going to continue listing symptoms because as I go through more autobiographical videos, which we're getting closer to, you will see how the symptoms come up and how they affect my life, and it will be highlighted. You'll get the picture, I think, much better than if I sit here listing things. So I'm going to talk a bit about the history of Asperger's and the recent changes to the DSM, because those are kind of connected. So let's go there. So Asperger's was first written about in 1944 by Dr. Hans Asperger. Unfortunately, because he wrote his paper in German during World War II, it was pretty much ignored. I don't even know if forgotten is the right word. I think most people didn't know it existed, which is frustrating because Dr. Leo Kanner's paper describing classic autism was only written a year earlier, 1943, and was accepted right away, or more or less right away, whereas Dr. Asperger's paper was, like I said, pretty much forgotten about. There are a few mentions of it here and there in the literature, but it wasn't popularized until 1981 by a British physician named Dr. Lorna Wing. And even though she was popularizing the term, it still wasn't in any official books or medical texts. And that paper that was written in 1944 was not translated into English until 1991 by Dr. Uta Frith, who, by the way, mentored people such as Dr. Simon Baron-Cohen and Dr. Tony Attwood. Those are good names to look up if you're interested in autism. So, the reason I'm telling you this history is because autism, when that paper was written, it was basically accepted and the diagnosis was used. Whereas Asperger's, it took so long for the paper to be found and translated into English that Asperger's syndrome did not enter the DSM, which stands for Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Illness. It didn't enter it until 1994 when the DSM-IV came out. And so what did DSM-IV look like? It had a category called Pervasive Developmental Disorders, and in that category is autism, PDD, NOS. NOS means not otherwise specified, Asperger syndrome, and two other things, Rett syndrome and childhood disintegrative disorder. So those first three diagnoses made up the autism spectrum as of 1994 in the DSM-IV. And I feel that this expanding of autism into a spectrum accounts, maybe not entirely, but accounts largely for the so-called autism epidemic. Because if you look at the statistics, there's no increase in cases on the lower end of the spectrum. The increase is on milder cases, and these are people who, like myself, would have been diagnosed with nothing or something else. So I think we've always been here, and I think it was just a matter of putting a name to it. I don't think there's a huge increase. I don't think there's an epidemic. I guess this would be a good place to insert something about anti-vaxxers. Those are desperate mothers looking for an answer when science doesn't have one necessarily. Like I said, I don't believe there's an increase, although there could be, I could be wrong. But I think it's largely because of better diagnoses and understanding what the spectrum is. And so vaccines do not cause autism, and even if they did, I'd rather live like this than have smallpox. So I think if your children aren't vaccinated, they shouldn't be allowed to attend school. I think we got to get a lot stricter about it. And back to the DSM. So I mentioned how the autism spectrum looked with those 3 diagnoses. In 2013, the DSM-V came out, and controversially, they eliminated the autism spectrum, and it just became autism spectrum disorder levels 1, 2, or 3, so mild, moderate, severe. And I've heard arguments on both sides. I've heard some people say that children won't get diagnosed, won't get funding for services. But I've also heard a statistic from someone from the Geneva Center for Autism in Toronto, a person well versed in autism. According to this person's research, 97% of people who were previously diagnosed would still be diagnosed. And I'm okay with the change. People ask me my opinion. Because my older brother has also autism spectrum disorder. He was born in 1981, and it took them years to diagnose him because at the time, it was thought autism included, speech deficits, language deficits, speech delays, intellectual disability. Whereas he does not have intellectual disability and he is fully verbal. So even though he did autistic things and still does, like flap his hands and walk on his toes, they were very, very hesitant for a long time, and eventually they settled on calling it high-functioning autism, basically meaning autism with no intellectual disability. But in more recent years, people started referring to him as having Asperger's, which I don't know if I agree with or not, because I've met other Aspies, and there's a difference. There's a difference between him and other Aspies. And at the end of the day, I don't know that we need to nitpick the label so much. I think just calling it autism spectrum disorder and saying that my brother and I are on the mild end and not nitpicking the exact label is okay. As long as we're still getting a diagnosis and we're still receiving services, I'm okay with the changes to the DSM. So Asperger's syndrome is no longer a diagnosis as of 2013, but I was diagnosed well before that, so I get to keep it. So that's basically your introduction to Asperger's syndrome. Like I said, I didn't really want to go on about symptoms too much because you'll learn more about it through my autobiographical videos. Sorry. So I think that's about it for this video. I was going to include my thoughts on the neurodiversity movement in my What is Asperger's video, but I realized I could easily do 10 minutes on that by itself, so that's going to be my next video. So this video is basically a brief history of Asperger's and the DSM, and I made mention of anti-vaxxers, and next time I will discuss neurodiversity, and that's it for today. Thank you.